She stood alone at her own wedding breakfast, a bride in ivory silk, and no one looked at her. The great hall of Ashworth Hall glowed with candlelight and the soft hum of polite conversation, but Alara Vance felt utterly invisible. Her new husband, Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, stood across the room speaking in low tones to his steward. He had not spoken her name once since the ceremony. He had not offered his arm when they walked from the chapel. When she had dared to meet his eyes during the vows, his gaze had been as cold and distant as a winter sea. Servants passed with silver trays, and guests moved around her as though she were a statue in an alcove. A cluster of elegant ladies whispered near the fireplace. Alara caught fragments. They say it was a political arrangement. Her father's lands border Ashworth. Poor thing, she cannot possibly compare to the late Duchess. No one will ever replace Eleanor. His Grace still wears black for her in his heart. Lara's fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched champagne glass. She had known this marriage was not born of love. Her father, Baron Vance, had spent years in bitter legal battles with the Duke over the boundary line that divided their estates. When the Duke had suddenly proposed a union to end the feud, her father had accepted with relief. Alara had arrived at Ashworth Hall 3 days before the wedding, full of quiet hope. She had imagined a man weary of conflict, willing to build something new. She had imagined kindness, perhaps eventually affection. Instead, she had found a fortress of silence. The Duke's steward, Mr. Aldridge, a young man with a kind face, passed by and offered a slight bow. "Are you well, Your Grace? May I fetch you something?" Alara forced a smile. "I am quite well, thank you." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but duty called him away. She was grateful for even that small moment of recognition. It was the only warmth she had received all day. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed and the candles had burned low, Alara sat in her new chambers, a beautiful room, decorated in pale blue and silver, but it felt like a gilded cage. A soft knock came at the door that connected her room to the Duke. Her heart stumbled. She smoothed her nightgown and whispered, "Enter." Alexander stepped inside. In the dim light, he was devastatingly handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. But his face held no tenderness. He closed the door behind him and stood with his hands clasped behind his back. "The marriage must be consummated," he said, as though discussing a business contract. "It is a formality, nothing more. You will have your own life here and I will have mine. I expect discretion and dignity. I will provide for you and any children. That is all." "That is all." The words fell like stones into a deep well, echoing long after he had left her sleeping chamber an hour later. He had been efficient, detached, and gone before the tears slipped silently into her pillow. She had not expected passion, but she had not expected to feel so utterly alone in the arms of her own husband. Days passed, then weeks. Alara tried. She learned his preferences from the housekeeper, Mrs. Harlow, how he took his tea, which newspapers he read, the fact that he despised roses but would never say so because they reminded him of his mother. She arranged fresh flowers on his desk, carefully avoiding roses. She asked the cook to prepare his favorite dishes. She made herself visible at breakfast, dressed beautifully, and asked gentle questions about his day. His answers were brief, never inviting. He looked through her, as though she were an acquaintance he could not quite place. One evening, Alara gathered her courage and knocked on the door of his study. He looked up from a stack of papers, annoyance flickering across his brow. "I wondered if you might like to walk with me in the garden tomorrow morning," she said, her voice carefully steady. "The roses are blooming and the lavender is lovely." He set down his pen. "I have no time for such things. You are free to walk alone. This estate is your home now. You need not ask permission." The dismissal was polite, but it cut deeply. She closed the door softly and stood in the corridor, pressing her palm against her chest, willing the ache to subside. Hope was such a fragile, stubborn thing. It refused to die, even when it was starved. The only light in those early months came from a small, unexpected source: Lady Charlotte, the Duke's 7-year-old daughter. At first, the child had regarded Alara with wary, sorrowful eyes, clearly missing the mother she had lost. She would often stand beside the large portrait of the late Duchess that hung in the morning room, staring up at the painted face. "My mother was the most beautiful lady in the world," Charlotte informed Alara one afternoon. "Everyone says so. She could play the pianoforte perfectly, and she always smelled like violets." Alara knelt to the child's level. "She sounds wonderful. You must miss her very much." Charlotte's lip trembled, but she lifted her chin. "Papa says I must be brave. He says he doesn't like to talk about her, but I see him staring at her portrait sometimes. I think he still loves her more than anyone." Alara's heart squeezed. "Love is not a thing that runs out, sweetheart. There is always room for more." Charlotte considered this. "Do you love my papa?" The question was so honest it stole Alara's breath. She chose her words carefully. "I am trying to be a good wife to him, and I would very much like to be your friend if you will let me." Something softened in the little girl's face. A few days later, Charlotte appeared at Alara's sitting room door clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit. "His ear is torn," she announced. "Mrs. Harlow said you are clever with a needle." Alara mended the rabbit while Charlotte watched, and from that small act a fragile friendship was born. They began taking walks together, collecting wildflowers, reading stories in the library. Alara's heart, so bruised by Alexander's coldness, found a small patch of sunlight in his daughter's company. It was not the love she had dreamed of, but it was something real. The Duke noticed, of course. One evening at dinner he said, "Charlotte speaks of you constantly. I trust you are not filling her head with foolishness." Alara set down her fork. "I am simply spending time with her. She is a lonely child. She needs laughter." Something flickered in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, but it vanished quickly. "See that you do not make promises you cannot keep." "I never make promises I do not intend to honor," she replied quietly. He stared at her for a long moment, as if truly seeing her for the first time. Then he returned to his meal in silence. The summer stretched on, and Alara began to settle into a rhythm of quiet endurance. She would rise early, breakfast with Charlotte, spend mornings in the garden or the village, afternoons with books or needlework, and evenings at dinners where her husband rarely spoke more than 10 words to her. She told herself she could survive this. Many women did. Then Lady Cecily Wentworth began to visit more frequently. Cecily was a widow of comfortable fortune, elegant and sharp-tongued, with hair the color of spun gold and a smile that never reached her eyes. She had been a close friend of the late Duchess Eleanor, or so she claimed, and she made it her mission to ensure Alara never forgot it. "Oh, Eleanor always arranged the flowers herself," Cecily remarked during tea one afternoon, her gaze sweeping over the arrangement Alara had carefully placed on the sideboard. She had such an eye for beauty. The Duke was so devoted to her. He would ride all the way to London just to bring her a particular ribbon she fancied. They were the great love story of the county. Alara kept her expression pleasant, though her stomach churned. "I am sure they were very happy." "Happy does not begin to describe it," Cecily said with a sigh. "When she died, a light went out of him. I think he still grieves her every single day. Some men simply cannot love twice." She gave Alara a look of false sympathy. "You must not blame yourself, my dear. It is not your fault you can never compare." The words struck with surgical precision. Alara excused herself shortly after, and behind the closed door of her room, she pressed her hands to her face and let the tears come. She was not jealous of a dead woman. She was not even angry. She was just so terribly, achingly tired of fighting for a heart that was already buried in the ground. And still that stubborn spark of hope refused to die. It clung to life, whispering that perhaps if she just tried a little harder he would see her. Perhaps if she could do something, anything, to prove her worth, he would finally turn his gaze her way. The dinner party, was the beginning of the end. It was a gathering of 20 guests, local landowners and their wives, the first formal event Alara had been permitted to host. She had spent days planning the menu, polishing the silver, arranging the flowers. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that made her dark hair gleam. When she descended the staircase, she caught Mr. Aldridge's appreciative glance from across the hall. The Duke did not even look up. During the second course, Lady Cecily steered the conversation toward the estate's renowned rose gardens. Eleanor designed the entire East Terrace herself, she announced to the table. It was her greatest joy. I do hope, Your Grace, that you have not allowed the plantings to suffer neglect. The Duke's jaw tightened. The gardens are maintained. Alara saw an opening to contribute. I have been working with the head gardener to add some new varieties to the west parterre. Perhaps we might consider a small public garden for the village children to enjoy. There was a brief, polite murmur of interest from the other guests. Then the Duke spoke. Eleanor, not now. The name dropped into the silence like a shard of ice. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. The entire table went still. Forks paused midair. Lady Cecily's eyes widened with barely concealed delight. Mr. Aldridge looked down at his plate as if he wished the floor would swallow him. The Duke's hand froze on his wine glass. He had not even seemed to realize what he had said. Then slowly, the understanding crept into his expression. He opened his mouth as if to correct himself. But he did not. The silence stretched. Alara's heart cracked along fault lines she had been desperately holding together for months. She forced her lips into a small, gracious smile, though her hands trembled beneath the table. "Excuse me," she whispered, rising from her chair with as much poise as she could summon. "I feel a slight headache coming on. Please do continue." She walked from the dining room without stumbling, without running, though every step felt like wadding through honey. She made it to the staircase, up the first flight, then the second. She did not go to her chambers. She went instead to a small, unused sitting room at the end of the east wing, a room no one ever visited. She closed the door, sat on the cold hearth, and wept with her hand pressed over her mouth so no sound could escape. He had called her by his late wife's name. He had looked at her, his living wife sitting right in front of him, and spoken another woman's name, in front of everyone. And then, even when he realized, he had offered no correction, no apology, no mercy. That night, something inside Alara died. The hope that had flickered and fought for survival through every cold breakfast and lonely night finally, quietly, went dark. She did not rage. She did not scream. She simply sat in that empty room and let the grief wash over her, and when it receded, she was no longer the woman who had arrived at Ashworth Hall full of tentative dreams. She was someone new. The next morning, Alara appeared at the breakfast table perfectly composed, dressed in a simple dove-gray gown. She poured her tea, buttered her toast, and read the newspaper. The Duke sat across from her, his expression unreadable. She could feel his gaze on her, but she did not raise her eyes. "I trust your headache has passed," he said after a long pause. "Yes, thank you," she replied pleasantly, "nothing more." He seemed to expect something, reproach, tears, perhaps another gentle attempt to bridge the distance between them, but she offered none. She finished her breakfast, bid him a polite good morning, and left the room. The days that followed were marked by a profound, deliberate stillness. Alara no longer arranged flowers on his desk. She no longer asked about his day or suggested walks in the garden. She did not seek him out at all. She was courteous, calm, and utterly untouchable. She had become a marble statue, graceful and cold. But she did not retreat into idleness, quite the opposite. She began spending her mornings in the village, visiting the tenant families who worked the Ashworth lands. She learned their names, their struggles, their small joys. She discovered that one family's child had a chronic cough that needed medicine they could not afford. She learned that the widow Ainsley's cottage had a leaking roof, and that the potter's daughter longed to learn to read. With quiet determination, Alara began to act. She used her own modest pin money, the allowance her father had given her as part of the marriage settlement, money the Duke had never thought to ask about, to purchase blankets, seed, and remedies. She hired the village carpenter to repair roofs and doors, paying him from her personal funds. She arranged for a tutor from the nearest town to give lessons to any child who wanted them, and she convinced the housekeeper, Mrs. Harlow, to help her organize baskets of food for the poorest families. She did not seek permission. She did not seek recognition. She simply did what her heart demanded. Mr. Aldridge, the steward, quickly became her ally. He was a capable, good-hearted man in his late 20s, with an easy smile and a deep affection for the estate. He saw the good Alara was doing and quietly arranged for supplies to be delivered where they were needed most. They often walked together through the fields, discussing crop yields and roof repairs, and sometimes they laughed at the antics of a particularly naughty goat that kept escaping its pen. "You have done more for this estate in a month than some do in a lifetime, Your Grace," Aldridge told her one afternoon as they stood watching the repaired cottage of the widow Ainsley. "The people here already love you." Alara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Then I have done something right." What she did not know was that the Duke had begun to notice her absence. He noticed the empty chair at the breakfast table, the silence in the halls where her soft footsteps had once lingered. He noticed that his study desk no longer held fresh flowers, and that no one politely inquired about his day. He noticed, too, the way Charlotte now lit up when Alara entered the nursery, chattering about the stories Alara had read her or the pressed flowers they had collected together. He noticed, and he was unsettled. One afternoon, he stood at the window of his study and watched Alara and Mr. Aldridge walking side by side along the lane that led to the village. They were deep in conversation, and then Aldridge said something that made Alara laugh. It was a light, unguarded sound that carried faintly through the glass. The Duke's hand tightened on the window frame. A cold, unfamiliar sensation coiled in his chest, sharp and hot. He recognized it eventually. It was jealousy. He tried to dismiss it as mere possessiveness, a husband's natural irritation at seeing his wife in easy company with another man. But it did not fade. It gnawed at him through the rest of the day and into the night. Lady Cecily, ever perceptive, did not miss the opportunity to pour salt into the wound. During one of her visits, she cornered the Duke in the garden. "Your new Duchess seems remarkably friendly with Mr. Aldridge," she remarked, her tone light and poisonous. "The servants talk, you know. They say she spends more time with him than she does with anyone else. I do hope there is nothing improper, for the sake of the estate's reputation." Alexander's face remained stone, but his voice was ice. "You overstep, Cecily." She smiled, unrepentant. "I only speak out of concern, dear Alexander. I would hate to see you humiliated. It is not as if she has any real reason to be loyal to you, is it? A marriage of convenience, a husband who still mourns another woman. One can hardly blame her for seeking comfort elsewhere." He did not answer, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. That evening he summoned Alara to his study. She entered calmly, hands folded in front of her, her face a polite, neutral mask. She had become so unreachable that he found himself almost angry. "I wish to speak with you about Mr. Aldridge," he said, his voice low. Something flickered in her eyes, but she did not falter. "He has been invaluable in assisting me with estate improvements. He is a good man and a loyal steward." "You spend a great deal of time with him." "I spend my time in service of the people who depend on this estate," she replied evenly. "Since I have little other purpose here, I chose to make myself useful. I was not aware my actions required your scrutiny." The Duke's composure cracked. "You are the Duchess of Ashworth. Your behavior reflects on this family. There are whispers." "Whispers," Alara repeated, and for the first time a hint of steel entered her tone. "Let me be perfectly clear, Your Grace. I have conducted myself with nothing but honor and dignity. I have not asked you for love. I have not asked you for companionship. I have not even asked you for kindness. I have simply stepped aside and built a life of service. If people whisper, it is because they have nothing better to do. And as for Mr. Aldridge, he is my friend, which is more than I can say for you." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Alexander stared at her, his chest tight. He had expected tears, perhaps a denial, maybe even guilt. He had not expected this calm, devastating honesty. "You are my wife," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes," Ilara said softly, "I am your wife. I have been your wife for nearly a year, and in that year you have never once looked at me as if I mattered. You called me by another woman's name in front of a room full of people. You let me stand alone at my own wedding. You came to my chamber and told me our marriage was a formality." She paused, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I loved you. I tried so hard to love you, but you would not let me. And now I am done trying." She turned and walked to the door. Before she opened it, she looked back over her shoulder. "I am not a leaner. I will never be a leaner, but I am also not invisible. I hope one day you will see that." She left, and the Duke stood motionless in the center of his study, the echo of her words crashing against the walls he had built so carefully around his heart. That night sleep would not come. He paced his chambers, replaying her words, the look in her eyes. She had said she had loved him, past tense. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Somewhere along the way, he had lost something he had not even known he possessed. Driven by a restless, unfamiliar need, he found himself in her empty sitting room. He was not sure what he was looking for, some clue, perhaps, to the woman he had so thoroughly ignored. On her small writing desk, tucked beneath a neat stack of correspondence, he found a sealed letter. It was addressed to him. He hesitated. He had no right, but the desperation clawing at his chest overrode his honor. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant, steady. "Your Grace, I write this letter not in anger but in quiet acceptance. I have come to understand that our marriage can never be what I once hoped. I have tried to be a good wife, but I see now that my presence brings you no comfort, only burden. I do not wish to be a source of pain or obligation to you or to sweet Charlotte. I propose that I take up residence in the Dowager House at the northern edge of the estate. I will continue to oversee the village improvements I have begun, and I will remain available to Charlotte whenever she wishes. I will not trouble you or seek your company. I will not ask for more than you are willing to give. I ask only that you allow me a small, quiet life of my own. I am not bitter, I am not angry, I am simply tired. I wish you every happiness, Alexander, I truly do. You are a good man even if you do not see it, and I hope one day you will let yourself love again. Ever your dutiful wife, Ilara." The paper trembled in his hand. He read it twice, 3 times, each word carving deeper into the hollow of his chest. She had been planning to leave, not in anger, not in scandal, but in a quiet, dignified surrender. She had given up. She had given up on him. He sat down heavily in her chair, the letter still clutched in his fingers. For the first time in years, Alexander Blackwood felt something he had sworn never to feel again. He felt afraid, not of scandal or ruin, but of losing a woman he was only just beginning to see. The next day, he sought out Mrs. Harlow. The housekeeper had been at Ashworth Hall for 30 years and knew more secrets than anyone. She was also fiercely protective of the new Duchess, a fact that became apparent the moment Alexander began to ask questions. "Her Grace has been visiting the tenant families, Your Grace," Mrs. Harlow said, her tone carefully neutral. "She has been using her own funds to provide medicine, food, and repairs. She paid for the widow Ainsley's new roof out of her own pocket. She arranged for a schoolmaster. She even sat up all night with the potter's wife when the woman was in labor because there was no one else to help." The Duke stared at her. She never said a word. "No," Mrs. Harlow agreed. "She never did. She does not seek praise. She simply does what she believes is right. The whole village adores her. They call her the people's Duchess." A deep, aching shame settled over Alexander. He had imagined her idle, wasting her days in trivial pursuits, or, worse, seeking the attention of other men. He had been so blinded by his own coldness that he had not seen the extraordinary woman living under his roof. But it was the next revelation that truly shattered him. "I did not wish to speak of this, Your Grace," Mrs. Harlow continued, her voice lowering. "But you should know. Last month, during the fever outbreak in the lower village, Her Grace went herself to nurse the sick. She caught a chill and was bedridden for 3 days. She asked me not to tell you. She said you would not wish to be disturbed." The Duke's blood turned to ice. She was ill. Very ill. The doctor feared for her lungs, but she recovered. She always recovers. She is stronger than she looks. Stronger than she looks. The words echoed in his mind. He had not noticed. He had not been there. He had been locked in his study, wrapped in his own grief and bitterness, while his wife risked her life for strangers and nearly died without him even knowing. He felt something crack deep inside him, the thick, frozen shell he had built around his heart since Aliner's death. It was not a gentle thawing. It was a violent, painful break, and through the cracks rushed a flood of emotions he could no longer hold back. Regret, longing, fear, and something that terrified him more than all the rest, love. He had to find her. The storm swept in just before dusk, black clouds rolling over the hills with a fury that rattled the windows of Ashworth Hall. Rain hammered the glass, and wind screamed through the chimneys. Alara was not in her chambers. She was not in the library or the nursery. Panic began to stir in Alexander's chest. He found Aldridge in the great hall, pulling on a heavy coat. "Where is the Duchess?" he demanded. "She went to the lower village this afternoon, Your Grace. There is a family there. The baker's wife is near her time, and Her Grace promised to bring the midwife. She sent word she would return before the storm, but—" Lightning flashed, and the Duke did not wait to hear more. He grabbed his own coat and strode toward the stables. Aldridge called after him, warning of flooded roads and treacherous conditions, but Alexander was already mounting his horse. He rode through the driving rain, following the lane toward the village. The river had swollen, spilling over its banks and flooding the lower fields. The bridge near the village was half submerged. He urged his horse forward, his heart pounding with a fear he had never known. When he reached the baker's cottage, he found the family huddled inside, the mother in labor, the midwife at her side. But Alara was not there. The baker's wife, between pained breaths, told him that the Duchess had left an hour earlier, determined to fetch more blankets from the village storehouse before the storm worsened. "She went alone," the woman said. "I tried to stop her." Alexander's blood ran cold. The storehouse was on the far side of the bridge. He turned and ran back into the storm. He found her near the swollen river, clinging to a broken fence post, her cloak soaked and her face pale with exhaustion. She had slipped on the muddy bank and twisted her ankle, unable to walk. The water was rising. "Alara," his voice was raw, barely audible over the roar of the storm. He splashed toward her, his boots sinking into the mud. When he reached her, he pulled her into his arms without hesitation, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with shock. "Alexander, what are you?" "Hold on to me," he commanded, his voice breaking. "Just hold on." He carried her through the flood, step by agonizing step, until they reached higher ground. He found an abandoned shepherd's hut and pushed the door open, laying her down on a rough cot inside. She was shivering violently, her lips tinged with blue. He stripped off his wet coat and wrapped it around her, then knelt beside the cot, his hands rubbing her cold arms, desperate to warm her. The storm howled outside, but inside the small hut there was only the sound of their breathing. "Why did you come?" she whispered, her teeth chattering. "You never come." The words broke him. He cupped her face in his hands, his voice hoarse. "Because I could not lose you, because I have been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." She stared at him, disbelief flickering in her tired eyes. "You called me Aliner, in front of everyone. You have never wanted me." "I know," he said, his forehead dropping to hers. "I know, and I have no excuse that will ever be enough, but I need you to hear this." He pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. Elena was not the woman everyone believed her to be. Ilara's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Alexander closed his eyes, and the secret he had carried for years finally rose to the surface. "After she died, I found letters, hidden in her jewelry box. She had a lover, a man she had loved before we wed. She married me for the title, for the security, but her heart was never mine. She was going to leave me. The fever took her before she could." Ilara's breath caught. "All this time, everyone thought you were mourning a great love." "I was mourning the love I thought I had," he said, his voice thick with old pain. "I was mourning the illusion, and I was so ashamed. I could not bear for anyone to know the truth, not for my sake, but for Charlotte. I did not want her to grow up believing her mother never loved her father, so I buried it. I buried everything. I swore I would never be so foolish again. I swore I would never let another woman close enough to hurt me." He took her hands, his grip desperate. "But you are nothing like her. You are kind and brave and so full of light, and I have treated you abominably. I called you by her name that night because I was still holding on to a ghost, but the ghost was never real. You are real, and I am so sorry." Ilara was silent for a long moment, the storm raging in the distance. Then slowly she lifted her hand and touched his cheek. Her fingers were cold, but her touch burned him like a brand. "I stopped hoping," she said softly. "I stopped hoping you would ever see me. It hurt too much." "I see you now," he whispered fiercely. "I see you, and I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I will spend the rest of my life earning it if you will let me." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Alexander." "I love you." The words tore from him, raw and unpolished, nothing like the careful, controlled declarations he had imagined. "I love you, and I have been terrified of it, but I am more terrified of losing you. Please, please do not leave me." She looked at him, this cold, proud man who was now on his knees in a shepherd's hut, soaked to the bone, his eyes full of a vulnerability he had never shown anyone. She saw the cracks in his armor, and instead of recoiling, she felt the last piece of her own broken heart shift back into place. "I am not leaving," she whispered. "I was never truly leaving. I needed to know I mattered." "You matter more than anything," he said. "More than this estate, more than my pride, more than any ghost." He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as though she were made of something precious and fragile. She buried her face in his chest and let herself cry, not the silent, hidden tears of the past months, but a release of all the pain and longing she had carried. When the storm finally passed, the sky outside the hut was streaked with pale gold. Alexander carried her back to Ashworth Hall as the first rays of dawn touched the wet fields. A doctor was summoned, and Ilara was put to bed with warm blankets and hot tea. The Duke did not leave her side. He was there when she woke the next morning, his hand wrapped around hers. He was there through her recovery, bringing her books, reading to her, making her laugh with awkward attempts at jokes. He was there when Charlotte burst into the room to fling her small arms around her stepmother, declaring that she had been so very scared and that Papa cried, but I promised not to tell. The walls he had built crumbled completely. In the weeks that followed, Alexander made his confession public, quietly and gently. He spoke to the household, to the tenants, and eventually to the guests who still whispered. He did not detail Eleanor's betrayal, but he made it clear that he had wronged his wife and that he was proud of the woman she was. Lady Cecily's visit stopped entirely. The portrait of Eleanor in the morning room was replaced by a new one, a painting of Ilara seated in the garden, Charlotte on her lap, with lavender blooming all around. One golden afternoon, as summer began to fade into autumn, Alexander found Ilara standing on the terrace where she had once walked alone. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. She leaned back into him. that I used to stand here and wonder if I would ever be loved. He tightened his hold, and now. She turned in his arms, her eyes bright. Now I know. He kissed her forehead, then her lips, soft and reverent. It was a kiss full of apology and promise, of a future that neither of them had dared to imagine. When they broke apart, Charlotte's laughter rang out from the garden below, and the sound was like a healing balm. The Duke of Ashworth had spent years trapped in a winter of his own making. But finally, the ice had melted and spring had come at last.